like Maggie said, I'm the head of SEO here at 2 Octobers. I've been doing technical and local SEO for about 10 years, mostly at the agency level. And one of the things I love most about SEO is that I really love solving problems. A little bit about 2 October. Sorry, did you go over the 2 October stuff when I was offline, Maggie?
A little bit. None of the stuff here except for the training and coaching side of things.
Cool. So just a little bit about us. We're an agency that's really purpose-driven as far as making the world a better place. And part of that is that we're a certified B Corp, which means that we are really intentional about the types of clients that we work with. And it also means that we're really intentional about how we do business. And if you want to learn more about being a B Corp, we have more information on our website. And you can also just do a search for B Corps. Diving into our agenda today, things that we're going to talk about, why planning ahead matters when you're forming your SEO strategy, the 5 things that I think you should focus on for 2021, and then some things to watch out for in 2021. And then, like Maggie said, we'll wrap up with some questions and some office hours. So 2020 has definitely been kind of a rocky year. A lot of people have equated it to kind of a dumpster fire of a year, especially when a lot of people put, and I'm sure some of you put a lot of planning into your 2020 strategies, and then have seen a lot of that go out the window as the year progressed. Some of the impact that we've seen of SEO throughout the year, we've seen a ton of traffic global traffic coming from Google search, and especially increases in Google image searches and Google map searches. We've seen a ton of online experiences start with people using search engines, and definitely a shift towards more traffic coming from organic search as well, and more of that search interaction coming from results on the first page, and people less likely to click on things on the second page. We've definitely seen a huge impact, especially in local SEO in 2020, huge increases in near me searches and people interacting with their smartphones a lot more than usual as well. One analogy that I like to think about when thinking about SEO strategy is that SEO strategy can be kind of like renting a house or buying a house. Renting a home is definitely nice. You don't have to deal with a lot of the maintenance that's required. Somebody will take care of a lot of the issues that pop up. But buying a home is definitely a long-term investment. You're definitely responsible for the upkeep that happens, responsible if something breaks, but it's also important to weigh those benefits of owning a home versus renting a home. There's a lot more return on your investment long-term if you own a home versus renting a home. And I think these similarities can be found in when you're thinking about your SEO strategy, and if you're going to invest in SEO long-term versus short-term, having a long-term SEO strategy and SEO, paying attention to SEO long-term can really impact you even after you stop necessarily putting a lot of time and energy into it. Having a strong technical base for your website, having a strong content foundation can definitely impact you long-term, especially versus some other channels like paid search, where once you stop doing those channels actively, you're going to stop seeing that ROI. So just something to think about when you're thinking about how much time and investment to put into your SEO strategy. Being able to pivot has definitely been essential for a lot of businesses in 2020, and I think that's definitely going to be important as we go into 2021. There's still a lot of unknowns, especially with SEO and how fast things can change. Google's always changing algorithms. Tactics that used to work 2 years ago don't necessarily work now. So making sure to maybe not necessarily plan a really strict strategy more than 6 months out can definitely set you up for more success, because you may have to pivot and things may change a little bit. So keeping that in mind as you're doing some of your 2021 planning. This is just one example of how some small businesses have pivoted going into throughout the year in 2020. A lot of small businesses added things like curbside pickup, virtual classes. A lot of restaurants went from just selling takeout to actually selling staples like bread or like flour, loaves of bread, butter, things like that that people usually get in grocery stores. So just some examples of how businesses have pivoted their strategies to things that were outside of what they had done prior to 2020, and thinking about how you can do that for your own businesses as well. Going into 2021, how you can think outside the box and be able to kind of pivot away from what you've always done to make sure that you can be successful even when things are a little different. So 5 things that we're going to talk about today as far as things that you should make sure that your SEO strategy includes in 2021: user experience, page speed, content, schema, and featured snippets. When it comes to user experience, 83% of KPIs tend to experience an increase in conversions when user experience is taken into consideration. User behavior KPIs like time on page and bounce rate have an impact in search visibility, and ranking well and UX are also about meeting the searcher's intent, which are also components of SEO as well. Sorry. So there's definitely, SEO or user experience can sometimes be its own channel or something to focus on. It definitely has implications as far as SEO goes, and definitely has benefits to make sure it's part of your SEO strategy. Oh, went too far. Also, when it comes to user experience, there's a lot of different facets. There's how people navigate your site. There's how people get through checkout forms. There's a lot of different areas of user experience. The one thing that I really want to focus on today is core web vitals. Core web vitals are something that Google announced in the last 6 to 8 months. They are focused on page speed, but from a user experience perspective. And Google has said that user experience will be a ranking factor in the coming months. So it's definitely something that to be aware of. I apologize, my neighbor's dog is going bonkers.
Sorry, hello, what was that you said about Google queries or?
Google core web vitals.
Core web vitals, okay, thank you.
Yeah, those will be, sorry, my neighbor's dog decided to bark right at that moment. Google has said that those will be part of the user experience part of the core web vitals will be a ranking factor going into 2021. So that's the area that I want to focus on today as part of user experience. Page experience doesn't override having great relevant content. Google wants you to make sure that you're still focusing on having good content while you're focusing on having a good page experience. So the two things definitely go hand in hand, and Google wants people to make sure that you are focusing on all components of the page: content, how the page loads, what people need to do to interact with the page in a way that makes sense. So keeping all of those things in mind when you're thinking about the page experience that users have on your website. So the core web vitals are a set of specific factors that Google says are important as far as user experience or page experience goes. The 3 core web vitals are largest contentful paint, first input delay, and cumulative layout shift. And we'll dive into each of those now. To actually get a sense for how your website is performing as far as the core web vitals go, you can dive into Google Search Console, which is a free tool that Google provides. If you're not familiar with it, you can set it up for your website by verifying your site through your hosting account, through Google Analytics or through Google Tag Manager, and you can get a whole host of information that Google deems important for your website. So the core web vitals information is one thing that shows up in Google Search Console. The first core web vital to pay attention to is largest contentful paint. Largest contentful paint is how long it takes a page to load from the view of an actual user. An example of that is the time that it takes a user to click on a link and then for them to actually see a majority of the page on that, or the majority of the content on that page load. That's largest contentful paint. And according to Google, anything below 2.5 seconds is in the good range. Anything over 4.0 seconds is in the poor range. So being kind of somewhere in that range will put you in a better place as far as Google's concerned and as far as users being able to see the content on your site quickly. When it comes to actually optimizing your site for largest contentful paint, some things that can have an impact. Images are important. So making sure that your images lazy load. If you have a lot of images on a page, if they load as somebody scrolls down the page versus having to have all of the images on a page load fully all at one time can definitely improve load time for a page. Resizing your images, so making sure that your images are uploaded in a size that's easy and fast to load and not relying on the code of the website or another program to actually resize the images for you. And then removing any unneeded images. So a lot of times maybe content will get updated and images will stay the same, or maybe there's images that just aren't necessarily relevant or helpful. So actually going through and making decisions about if images that are really resource heavy are actually needed or not needed. Another thing that can really impact how fast content loads for users is hosting. Better hosting providers equal a faster load time. If you're using WordPress, there's a lot of really great hosting providers that specialize in WordPress that can, using a host like that can really impact for the better the load time of your website. And then pruning content. So cleaning up content and page elements. So cleaning up large elements that might be slowing things down can be really helpful. One thing we'll touch on in a few minutes is paying attention to page elements that might not be needed on every single page and cleaning those up if that's a possibility. The second core web vital is first input delay. And first input delay is the time that it takes for a user to actually interact with a page. So if you have like a form or somebody needs to use a menu or open an accordion menu on a mobile device, that's first input delay. And Google's benchmark is anywhere below 100 milliseconds is good, and anywhere over 300 milliseconds is poor. This is an example of a sign-in page for Reddit, for example. And this is so there's images on the side of the page that aren't necessarily needed on the sign-in form. That can slow down the page load time. So removing something like that image could be helpful and make this form faster to load. If there's JavaScript or other code in the back end of a page that maybe just by default gets pulled into every single page on a website, but isn't necessarily needed on something like a sign-in form, removing that can speed up the process and make it quicker for users to interact with the sign-in form. Some other things that can be helpful when optimizing for first input delay, like I just said, deferring JavaScript that might not be necessary on those pages or minimizing it if possible. Removing third-party tracking codes. So things like Google Analytics, heat maps that don't need to be on certain pages. So a sign-in form versus a sign-up form may not necessarily need Google Analytics depending on your KPIs. So really going through your website and identifying areas where certain tracking codes aren't necessary. And then lastly, enabling caching to speed things up. Every time you visit a website, parts of the page are stored in your browser so that it takes less time for a page to load each time you return to that page. If you make sure that caching is enabled on your website, this will definitely speed things up for return users. And this is especially important with things like e-commerce sites, where you're really wanting people to return, and you want to make sure that that process is as fast as possible for them when they're adding things to cart and checking out and that sort of thing. And the third core web vital is cumulative layout shift. This one's kind of a tongue twister. Google's benchmark for this one is anything below 0.1 is good, and anything over 0.25 is poor. Cumulative layout shift is how stable a page is as it actually loads. So an example would be if you have different elements on a page, and as a page is loading, those elements are shifting, and someone's going to click on something, and as that page is loading, those elements are moving. So somebody actually clicks on the wrong element because that element moved as the page was loading. We see this happen a lot of times with like ad placement. You'll see a page loading and you'll go to click on the link that you want to click on, but you end up opening an ad instead because the ad placement was not static on the page. So some things to consider with optimizing for cumulative layout shift, making sure that you use set attributes for image sizes, so that the browser knows how much space that element actually will take up, and it doesn't cut into that space with other elements. Like I just mentioned, ad elements should have a reserved space, so that way they're not moving and taking up space or shifting as far as they go. And then making sure that any interactive elements are getting placed below the fold, so that they don't change when users expect the page content to change. So making sure that things like forms or anything like that load below the fold, so that way they stay where they need to stay as well. So to recap, the user experience things that we just talked about, making sure to minimize the time it takes for the user to see the page content. The quicker a user can see page content, the more likely they are to actually stay on a page. We want to make sure that people aren't bouncing off pages, because Google picks up on that if people are coming to your site and bouncing off right away. That sends negative signals to Google. Making sure form interaction is as fast as possible, especially if contact form fill outs or bookings or anything like that are an important KPI for your business. You want to make sure that that process is as fast as possible. And then making sure that page elements don't move, so that people aren't clicking on things that they weren't expecting to click on. That gives a poor user experience as well.
And hey, Nikki, before you move on, we had a couple questions that I think are relevant to the last section. So first, any suggestions on how to assess a good host, considering, everyone you ask usually has a different suggestion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from a WordPress perspective, my personal preferences are things like Kinsta or WP Engine, places that definitely host a ton of WordPress sites. As far as non-WordPress sites, I think asking for examples of sites that they're hosting, and then actually running your own speed tests on those sites. Paying attention to if you're sharing a server, so if they have dedicated hosting, if you're on a shared hosting server, how many sites are on a shared hosting server. Those types of things are definitely good things to ask the hosting provider.
Cool. And then one more. So do you feel like the CLS measurement in Google Search Console is accurate for most sites?
From what I've seen so far, it definitely seems to be pretty accurate. I think, as with any of these metrics, and I'll talk about it with page speed as well, making sure that you're testing on a page by page basis for your site, and then also testing for what the standard seems to be in your industry. So if your website is a really heavy news publisher, you're publishing a lot of news content every day, run some tests on other news sites in your industry and see what the kind of benchmark tends to be for the sites that are ranking really well as far as some of the core web vitals go, and maybe not necessarily shooting for the highest, the best number as far as those metrics go, but shooting for what the sites that are ranking best are achieving. Could definitely be a way to make some progress with what's happening in your industry.
Cool. And then one more. So I've been finding that some third-party CDNs like Cloudflare have actually been loading slower. Do you have a comment on that?
I've seen that recently with some of the CDNs, and I think my take on it is that the core web vitals are still pretty new, and that possibly maybe some of the CDNs haven't adjusted to some of these recommendations yet.
Cool. All right. And I think you can move on to the next section, but everybody, please feel free to keep chatting. And sometimes I'll interject, sometimes I'll hold it off to the end. So if you don't hear a response from me, it's because I'm holding it to the end.
Thanks, Maggie. So page speed is obviously super important. With every second of page load time, the probability on a mobile site of seeing user bounce increases exponentially. We know that Google has switched from a desktop index to a mobile first index. They've said that rollout's been slowed down by a lot of the business challenges of 2020. So we're not going to fully see the impacts of that rollout until 2021. But making sure that from a page speed perspective, you're thinking about how your site loads on a mobile device. So like we talked about with user experience, the longer it takes for a website to load, the more likely someone is to bounce and leave the site. So making sure that that is something that is top of mind when you're thinking about how your site loads. And poor page speed also means that users are less likely to actually complete a transaction or to return to your site if they had a really poor experience with how fast things were loading. So when it comes to optimizing for page speed, there's obviously a lot to think about, but some of the most important things that I think that you should pay attention to are image optimization. So thinking about, like I said before, uploading the size of image that you need. Not only does this impact user experience, but it impacts page speed as well. Actually uploading the size you need instead of relying on the code of your website or plugin to size that image. Hosting those images on a CDN, in most cases is helpful. We're obviously seeing a little bit of shift in that right now with some of the core web vitals being implemented, but typically hosting things like images on a CDN can be helpful. Using a CDN in general, seeing we're talking about those, a CDN, if you're not aware, is a content delivery network that helps distribute the load of the content that's being delivered. So essentially copies of your website are placed on multiple servers, and then that way users have access to a faster version of your website, depending on where they're at geographically. And then the other thing that can really impact page speed is redirects. So if you have a lot of internal links that are linking to a 301 redirected version of a page and are linking to that old version of the URL, every time Google goes and crawls that URL or a user clicks on it, they have to go through the process of loading, or the browser has to go through the process of loading that redirect, seeing that there's an old URL, and then redirecting the browser to that new URL. So making sure that all of your internal links, if there are redirected URLs, are uploaded or are updated to the most recent version of a URL instead of that redirected version. If you have pages with 404 errors, making sure those are redirected when possible, so that Google or users aren't landing on pages that don't exist anymore, and then cleaning up redirect chains as well. So if there are multiple, if you maybe had an HTTP site and then you upgraded to HTTPS, and at one point you dropped your www, making sure that all of those redirects are redirecting to the final place, and removing all of those different hops so that things are a lot faster. When it comes to page speed testing, there's a lot of different testing tools that can be helpful. My go-to is Google Page Speed Insights to start getting an idea if there are issues or things that need to be investigated further. And then I typically will go to something like Web Page Test, which will give a lot more detail on specific issues and a little more technical level. If there are issues that were flagged in Google Page Speed Insights, Google Search Console is also a good place that will give you some insights onto how your pages are loading. And then, like I mentioned with the previous one of the questions before, is what is the industry standard? So not only optimizing for what Google's benchmarks are as far as page speed goes, but also optimizing for what high-ranking sites in your industry tend to be loading at. And then also making sure that you're testing by the page and not just relying on how like your homepage tests. Making sure that you're testing multiple pages on your site, because different page templates will have different resources. So different types of pages on your site are going to load differently. The third thing that I think is important to pay attention to for 2021 is content. 72% of marketers polled said that content marketing was one of their most effective SEO tactics. We know that useful quality content that answers the searcher intent definitely helps improve brand awareness and search visibility. Google makes it apparent with almost every single algorithm update that content is important. It used to be having quantity of content was more important than the quality of content, and that you should just write keyword stuffed content because that's what Google was rewarding. And we've definitely seen that shift, and now actually having content that people find helpful, imagine that, is what Google wants to see. So making sure that you're creating content because it's important, but that you're also creating content that is of a high quality and is what people are looking for. Things to help you in thinking about content for your own site. Actually do research and define who your target audience is, what they need, and what they're looking for, and keep those things in mind when you're creating content. Identify the keywords that your audience is actually using. So doing research to figure out not necessarily what keywords necessarily have the highest search volume, but what keywords people are using. Sometimes keywords that have a lower search volume, but maybe are more transactional or are have more searcher intent behind them are keywords that you should be incorporating into your site. So your on-page content, like your title tags, your meta descriptions, and the rest of your on-page content. And then making sure, like I keep saying the word user, write for the users, directly address questions that people are asking in search, things that they're looking for. A really great resource is looking at the people also ask search results. So if you type in something in Google search and then you scroll down a little bit, you'll often see the people also ask. This is a really great way to get a sense for what people are searching for, and using that in your content strategy. And then also, even when you start to type in a search query in the Google search browser, you'll start to see it auto-populate. That's not an accident. That's based on things that people search for based on what you're typing in. And that's also a really great way to start to get ideas on what people are actually searching for and searcher intent when you're creating your content strategy. And if you want to know more about how to create a great audience-driven content strategy, my coworker Yasmin did a really great workshop that you can access the YouTube recording of on our website. And we'll share out this deck afterwards so you can access any links that were shared. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is Schema. Schema is back-end markup that helps tell Google what a page is about, and it helps prompt the appearance of different SERP features. Studies have shown that sites have seen a 51% increase in click-through rate after adding something like FAQ schema to an FAQ page or FAQ type content. SERP features can be more enticing and improve click-through rates. So SERP features like review stars or product information in the SERP, things that can be prompted by having schema on a page. And SERP features definitely can help take up SERP real estate and push down other results, which we'll see some examples of in a second. So when it comes to schema, the things that I think it's most important to pay attention to going into 2021, FAQ schema. So marking up not only your FAQ pages, but anytime there's FAQ content. So if you have FAQ content on product pages or category pages, making sure that's marked up with FAQ schema. Paying attention, like I mentioned, to the people also ask search results is a great way to get FAQ type content for your site if your site's missing that. Adding in product schema. So adding product schema gives searchers more product information in the SERP, like pricing information, if a product is in stock, if there's reviews for that product, just more information to make your SERP results more enticing and get people to click on them. And then how-to schema, if you have how-to content on your website, maybe in a blog section or a resource section, is a really great way to get more featured snippets for that content. And featured snippets are something we'll talk about in the next section. So when it comes to actually implementing schema, some examples of where we see schema taking up more SERP real estate with the FAQ schema showing up here, it's actually taking up a space that could be filled by another SERP result. So it's actually pushing some of these results down lower because the FAQs are actually showing up in the SERP and possibly enticing people to click further into the page because they want to find out more information about some of the questions that they're getting answered. And then further down, we see an example of product schema showing up in the SERP, where we see the review stars show up, we see the price for the search query. Another example of schema showing up in the search is the visual aspect. So because there's product schema on those pages are showing up as part of the software. So they're showing up for the informational type of search feature. Some tools that are really beneficial when coming up with schema for your site. It's definitely not code that you have to start from scratch with every time. Utilize resources that are already out there. The digital agency Merkle has a really great schema generator. It has lots of different builders for things like local business schema, FAQ schema, blog schema. You basically type in your information and it outputs the code that you can then upload to your site. Google's rich result testing tool is a great way to then test that code and make sure that it works before implementing it on your site. And then Google Search Console as well. Again, one thing that I had mentioned before was paying attention to what's happening in the industry, what's happening in the SERPs for your specific field. So seeing what types of schema your competitors are using is a really great way to get ideas of what types of schema you should be implementing on your site if you're not sure where to start. And one thing that I also wanted to add too is that actually getting schema implemented on your site doesn't have to be, you don't have to be reliant on a developer. The best way to implement it is to have a developer actually put the code in a page template. But if you don't have access to a developer, there's some great resources on how to implement schema via Google Tag Manager. It is kind of like a Band-Aid fix. It's not the best way to implement schema long-term, but it can be a great way to at least get it on your site while you're waiting for a developer who may or not have time right away, or you might not have developer resources right now to help you do that. And the last area I want to talk about is featured snippet. As mobile search becomes more and more of an area of focus, we're seeing that around 50% of a mobile screen is sometimes covered with a featured snippet. You see this a lot with answer boxes and things for like recipe searches, things like that, where you'll see a lot of the real estate taken up by that featured snippet. And we tend to see featured snippets appear when there is a search result that specifically answers a searcher's query. So this is an example of a paragraph featured snippet where someone searched for the best way to reheat pizza, and they see the full paragraph of instructions show up right at the top of the page in the SERP result. Another example is a numbered list. This is in how the page content was optimized because of how they created that list. Google thought this was the best way to answer that query with the numbered list of steps for that question. And that's the type of featured snippet that we're seeing. Similarly to the numbered list, bulleted lists show up. Again, Google thought this was the best way to mark this up. This looks like it's probably a blog post. So there's probably article schema on here. And then there's a bulleted list. So Google's pulling that in as the featured snippet. Another example of featured snippets can be tables. So if you have an HTML table and that's marked up likely with, I don't even know, probably a blog schema again, maybe not. But Google's pulling in this table for some reason as the best response for Pizza Hut based on the information found in the table. Becoming more popular are video featured snippets. 9 times out of 10, these are going to be populated by YouTube because that's Google's video search engine. So thinking about if you have videos on your site, marking those up with video schema, and if you have the option to embedding YouTube videos over any other platform, considering to do that because that's where Google's most likely going to pull video search results from, is if they're hosted on their own platform. Another example of a featured snippet is the knowledge panel. This tends to show up a lot for brand searches, powered sometimes by things like by organization schema. But the more traffic a brand has, the more authority a brand has, the more likely it is to have a brand knowledge panel. And similar to the knowledge panel is the knowledge card, which basically pulls in more specific information from the knowledge panel. You can see before the search was just Tesla, so we got the whole knowledge panel, and then a specific search about when Tesla was founded, we got just the knowledge card that specifically answers that information. And one thing to think about with featured snippets and why they can be important to have is that featured snippets often mean fewer clicks for a searcher to get an answer. So if a user can get an answer from the featured snippet, they're tending to could be less likely to actually click to the website. So if you can get featured snippets for certain search queries that maybe aren't as important for a user to come to your website, but still get that information in front of a user and get brand awareness, that can definitely be a benefit to having a featured snippet for certain search queries. Things to think about when optimizing your site for featured snippets and your content. Do your research. Look at the keywords where you're ranking below spot 1. Look at the keywords where you're ranking between position 2 and 10, and think about how you could get featured snippets for those keywords. Look at what's already triggering the featured snippets for those keywords and how you could quote unquote steal some of those featured snippets. So like we looked at, if it's a bulleted list, if it's a video, how could you update your content so that it is considered featured snippet worthy? Create new content with featured snippets in mind, but don't just create content to have a featured snippet. So if you weren't going to create that content, it's maybe not super valuable, but you want to get a featured snippet for that content, not necessarily the best reason to create content. But as you're creating content, look at what featured snippets are out there for those keywords and make sure to include that into how you're creating that content. And then use tools like SEMrush or Ahrefs to track the progress of the content you're creating and see if it's getting featured snippets. So quick recap, things that we covered today: paying attention to user experience, specifically core web vitals, making sure that page speed is on your radar, that you're taking that into consideration with the pages on your site and the different areas of your site. Making sure that content is a key part of your 2021 strategy, that you're focusing on the quality of the content you're creating and that it's matching user intent for the audience that you want coming into your website. Paying attention to the different types of schema that's out there. There's a lot of great resources out there on how to get started and how to create the schema that is most beneficial for the different types of pages on your site. And then lastly, like we just talked about, paying attention to featured snippets and where those make sense for the content that you have on your site. As far as things to look out for and to watch for in 2021, one of the new things that's getting a lot more visibility is Google Discover. Google Discover is kind of like a news feed that shows up on mobile devices. It's kind of like Google meets social media a little bit. It's interesting. But Google Discover will automatically show personalized content based on a user's search history, based on a user's browser history, different app activity, and user's location. Google then uses all that information to identify and display topics that Google thinks are relevant to you based on your interests. Google Discover tends to be related to sports and entertainment. We're definitely the most prevalent things that we're seeing in Google Discover. We're seeing Google Discover be largely focused on hobbies and activities, and brands are also seeing a strong presence in Google Discover as well, according to a Search Engine Journal article. News definitely seems to, e-commerce and news definitely seem to have the biggest number of URLs in Google Discover articles, with entertainment being the next biggest chunk. When thinking about Google Discover, it's important to make sure that your site and your content are mobile friendly, because that's the only place we're seeing Google Discover. So as everything else that you're focusing on, making sure that optimizing for mobile is at the forefront. Thinking about Google Discover, it's also important to think about entities. So entities are what connect your brand and users. So thinking about your brand and then what some of those related entities could be. So if you're an outdoor brand, what hobbies and activities users are also interested in are entities of your brand. And then the last thing is creating content that's relevant, useful, and timely. We see the Google Discover content be typically stuff that's really relevant with what's happening in the world. So paying attention to things like Google Trends and creating content that you're trying to get show up in Google Discover would be probably an important thing to consider. And then another thing to pay attention to, if you're a local business going into 2021, is paying attention to Google My Business. Google My Business is constantly adding features and constantly changing things, especially with the things that have happened in 2020. Google My Business has changed and added so many features this year, as far as curbside pickup being able to show up in Google My Business listings, and COVID hours changes, and all kinds of different features that have been added this year. So making sure that to pay attention to Google My Business if you're a local business. As far as upcoming workshops we have here at 2 October, make sure you join us in January for social ads for the analytical marketer with Karen O'Toole, and keep an eye on our upcoming training schedule as we add more workshops for 2021. Thank you guys for hanging in there today, and we'll switch over to office hours for any questions.